Welcome back to my lecture on style and stylistics. It is the second part that I resume. I was disconnected in between due to communication failure in our area. So let me resume my lecture. In transformational linguistics, the basic theory had no explicit treatment of style, but this does not mean that transformational grammar is of no use to stylistics. Transformational grammar is a model which may give an account of the sequence of choice at one's disposal when he wishes to say something. If style is a choice, then transformation grammar is invixed in 1971 claims the grammatical model that so far most fully maps out the system and range of this choice by accounting for features that do not actually appear on the surface of a text. Transformation grammar should be capable of analyzing figures such as ellipses, or for example, with increased rigor and through the semantic matrices of recent transformation grammar, the definition and study of metaphor, a vexing subject of many linguistics, is given uh, a particular kind of transformation, particularly optional transformations, may be said to constitute his syntactic style. In British linguistics, there was a big concern with granting a style a place in the linguistic theory, as it might be expected of a school with J.R. Firth as its stimulus. Terms such as register and field, mode, and tenor of discourse gave increasing precision to British discussion. Some British works, notably Halliday's papers on transitivity and theme, contain a number of concrete points very useful to the analyst of styles. Hallidayan functionalism added a socio-cultural dimension that began to explain the stylistic choices in literary texts. Some linguistic approaches to style. Though linguistic theories did not have the study of style on their agenda, a large number of stylistic studies have used models derived from or at least inspired by those theories. Indeed, as Freeman in 1970 remarks, work in linguistics and the increased interest in linguistic approaches to literary studies in the second half of the 20th century led to the emergence of modern linguistic theory as a contributory discipline to literary criticism. Freeman divides the work in linguistic stylistics in the 1960s into three types: style as a deviation from the norm, style as a recurrence or convergence of textual pattern, and style as a particular exploitation of grammar of possibilities. In its rejection of impressionism and its adherence to an objectivity and quantification, the style as deviation school occasionally led methodology overwhelm its subject. Such a misconception of the nature of literary study exists in some works in stylistic, especially those strongly influenced by behaviorist philosophy of science. To refer to a given literary effect as a stimulus with the philosophical commitments inherent in such a term is to do violence to the very nature of literature. Another difficulty in the work of style as deviation is its definition of the norm from which an author's style is supposed to differ in certain ways. For example, Carter in 1997 raises these questions. What is the norm? Do we not mean norms? Is the norm the standard language? The internally constituted norms created within a single text? The norms of a particular genre, a particular writer's style, the norms created by a school of writers within a period, and so on. If it is the norms of a standard language, then what level of language is involved? Grammar, phonology, discourse, semantics? Style as a particular exploitation of a grammar of possibilities incorporates a notion of a grammar that goes beyond that literary text, which implies that certain typical characteristics, that is, selections from these possibilities, are indicative of what Richard Ullman has called a writer's cognitive orientation, Freeman in 1970. This approach is based on the transformational generative grammatical theory. According to this theory of grammar, language can be characterized at two levels of representation: a deep meaning and surface sound. Syntactic structure. The two levels are interrelated by an ordered set of transformations. The notion of a style as a recurrence of convergence of textual pattern has stemmed in large part from Roman Jakobson's famous dictum: the poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. A poetic language, Jacobson argues, seeks in its chain or combinatory relationships, its syntactic elements, the same properties of close coherence that are to be found among the individual members of a choice relationship or paradigm. Examples of such view of style can be found in the work of M.A.K. Halliday and Geoffrey Leach on cohesion, which Halliday has characterized as a grouping of descriptive categories organized around the lexical and grammatical means of unifying a literary text. Cohesion, which is realized at different ranks of linguistic structure, is a syntagmatic or chain relationship. It can be grammatical. Such items as anaphoric determiners, pronouns, demonstrative, and certain adverbs, such so, or lexical repetition of lexical items, or sequential occurrence of items from the same lexical set. Now, on stylistics. In 1969, Leach writes, I mean by stylistics simply the study of literary style, or to make matters even more explicit, the study of the use of language in literature. Short defines stylistics as an approach to the analysis of literary texts using linguistics description. Verdonk in 2002 defines stylistics as the analysis of distinctive expression in language and the description of its purpose and effect. He remarks that the way such analysis and description should be conducted and the way their relationship is to be established are matters of dispute among the stylisticians. Another definition of stylistics is that offered by Simpson in 2004 as a method of a textual interpretation in which primacy of place is assigned to language. As for the importance of language to stylisticians, Simpson suggests that the various forms, patterns, and levels that constitute linguistic structure are an important index of the function of the text. The text's functional significance as discourse acts in turn as a gateway to its interpretation, while linguistic features do not of themselves constitute a text's meaning. An account of linguistic features nonetheless serves to ground a stylistic interpretation and to help explain why for the analyst certain types of meaning are possible. Although stylistic analysis was at first a way of applying linguistic models to literary texts, such models can now be applied to the analysis of any type of text to non literary registers as well as the literary. Consequently, the concern of stylistics has extended from an initial preoccupation with literary texts to include any kind, written or spoken. McRae and Clark in 2004. The purpose of stylistics. Leach and Short state that stylistics, simply defined as the linguistic study of style, is rarely undertaken for its own sake, simply as an exercise in describing what use is made of language, but rather to explain something, and in general, literary stylistics has implicitly or explicitly the goal of explaining the relation between language and artistic function. They elaborate by using motivating questions are not so much what as why and how from the linguist's angle. It is why does the author here choose the form of expression. From the literary critic's viewpoint, it is how is such an aesthetic effect achieved through language. Thus for them the aim of literary stylistics is to relate the critic's concern of aesthetic appreciation with the linguist's concern of linguistics description, using term appreciation to comprehend both critical evaluation and interpretation. Although they comment it is with interpretation that stylistics is more directly concerned. Hassan in 1971 argues that the usefulness of the study of literary language for stylistic purposes does not rest on how many facts about the language are accumulated. It rests on how many of these facts are shown to be significant to the text as an instance of literature. Similarly, Wells argues the goal of most stylistics is not simply to describe the formal features of or in order to relate literary effects to linguistic causes where these are to be relevant. For Simpson in 2004, doing stylistics enriches our ways of thinking about language because it investigates language and more specifically investigates creativity in language use. By the use of language models, the method of analytic inquiry acquires an important reflexive capacity in that it can shed light on the very language system it derives from. It tells us about the rules of language because it often explores texts where those rules are bent, distended, or stretched to a breaking point. In contemporary stylistic analysis, a prerequisite to doing stylistics is interest in language. According to Bradford in 1997, stylistics enable us to identify and name the distinguishing features of literary texts and to specify the generic and structural subdivisions of literature. Tulan points out stylistics can be used for a variety of purposes, including the teaching of language and literature. It can also be used as a means of demystifying literary responses, understanding how varied readings are produced from the same text, and it can be used to assist in seeing features that might not otherwise have been noticed. It can shed light on the crafted texture of the literary text as well as offering a productive form of assistance in completing interpretations, making them more complex and richer. Stylistics can thus be used both as a descriptive tool and as a catalyst for interpretation. The principles of stylistics. It is hard to specify a set of procedures, methodologies, and theories for stylistics because of the many strains and subfields which have developed out of it. However, it is possible to list some principles by which most, if not all, of stylistic operates. Stylistics as text based on text. Jeffries and McIntyre stress that stylistics derives its existence from texts being analyzed, and although some recent developments in cognitive stylistics posit processes that a reader engages in while he is reading a text, the task of a stylistician remains that of working out what effect is achieved by particular texts, whether the research aims are phrased as a cognitive, a linguistic, or a literary question. Cognitive, corpus, or discourse stylistics of the early 21st century, though very considerably the main text based in their attempt to explain something about the operation and effect of a particular text's objectivity and empiricism. Jeffries and McIntyre argue that objectivity in the stylistic analysis does not mean making impassive comments on the meaning of a text without regard to context or ideology. In this regard, Wells in 2001 says that stylistics is only objective in the sense of being methodological, methodological, methodical, methodical, systematic, empirical, analytical, coherent, accessible, retrievable, and consensual. Jeffries and McIntyre in 2010 maintain the requirement of an empirical approach to study is that all claims should be based on observation on experience. In other words, the strictly empirical approach would insist upon an inductive method of working whereby the patterns observed in large quantities of data would be the only available outcomes of the study, and no generalizations and predictions beyond these outcomes would be permissible. In practice, some branches of stylistics are more inductive, as for example corpus stylistics, and some more deductive, as for example critical stylistics in method. Within these subfields, many studies will in fact use both approaches to answering research questions. Thus, many stylistic approaches may analyze a set of texts or extracts from texts and describe what is found empirically, whilst also making predictions from this basis about the likely occurrence of similar features and effects in other data. Stylistics uh, eclectic and open. Generally speaking, stylistics is not a discipline to be constrained to one practical or theoretical viewpoint or methodology. In fact, the main strength of the discipline has been to remain open to new theories of language and literature, and to evolve the incorporating the new insights into its practice. Choice, analysis, and interpretation. This set is more specific to linguistics and those mentioned above. Choice implies that there are many different ways of saying something. This element of choice over how to say something was the proper subject of a study for stylistics. However, that choice is constrained by non linguistic factors. The other principle concerns the relationship between analysis and interpretation, the choice of what data to study, which tools of analysis to use, and the other principle concerns. Hello, hello, hello. However, any attempt at interpretation should take context into account if the research is to be satisfactorily completed. From its earlier formalist and structuralist beginnings, stylistics has broadened to include three distinct but interrelated strands, any of which can independently form the primary focus of study or lend themselves to viable combination with either or both of their. From its earlier formalist and structuralist beginnings, stylistics has broadened to include three distinct but interrelated strands, any of which can independently form the primary focus of a study or lend themselves to viable combination with either or both of their alternatives. These strands are that which is concerned with the recognizably formal and linguistic properties of a text existing as an isolated item in the world, that which refers to the points of contact between a text, other texts, and their readers, listeners, that which positions the text and the consideration of its formal and psychological elements a socio within a socio points of contacts between a text, other texts, and their readers or listeners, that which positions the text and the consideration of its formal and psychological elements within a socio-cultural context. It was told by McRae and Clark. Bradford divides these three strands into two basic categories, textualist and contextualist. The formalists and new critics are mainly textualists in that they regard the stylistic figure of a particular literary text as productive of an empirical unity and completeness. They do not perceive literary style as entirely exclusive to literature. Rhythm is an element of all spoken language and narrative features in ordinary conversation. But when these stylistic features are combined so as to dominate the of a fabrics the of a text, that text is regarded as literature. Contextualism involves far more loose and disparate collection of methods. Its unifying characteristic is its concentration on the relation between text and context. Some structuralists argue that the stylistic features of poetry draw upon the same structural frameworks that enable us to distinguish between modes of dress or such social rituals as eating. Some feminists regard literary style as a means of securing attitudes and hierarchies that in the broader context maintain the difference between male and female roles. Textualists record the ways in which literature borrows features from a non-literary language, but maintain that these borrowings are transformed by the literary stylistics of the text. Contextualist stylistics is a broad church, and its various factions are united in their emphasis on the ways in which literary style is formed and influenced by its context. These involve the competence and disposition of the reader, the prevailing socio-cultural forces that dominate all linguistic discourses, including literature, and the systems of significance through which we all process and interpret all phenomena, linguistic and non-linguistic, literary and non-literary. Modern stylistics is caught between two disciplinary imperatives. On the one hand, it raises questions regarding the relation between the way that language is used and its apparent context and objective language as an active element of the real world. On the other, it seeks to define the particular use of linguistic structures to create facsimiles, models, or distortions of the real world literary language. Linguistic and Literary Stylistics. Carter and Simpson in 1989 state that linguistic stylistics is the study of style and language for the sake of a refinement of models for the analysis of language and thus to contribute to the development of linguistic theory. On the other hand, what distinguishes work in literary stylistics, they remark, is the provision of a basis for fuller understanding, appreciation, and interpretation of avowedly literary and author-centered texts. The general tendency will be to use linguistic insights in the service of fuller interpretation of language effect than is possible without the benefit of linguistics. In general, analysis will involve multiple levels, unlike the kind of single level rigorous characterizing such work in linguistic stylistics. Indeed, it is a good that style itself results from a simultaneous convergence of effects at a number of levels of language and organization. Todorov does not accept the distinction. He believes that they are two complementary aspects of one and the same distinction, and that it is not necessary to oppose stylistics of language and one of literature. According to him, there exists only a theoretical stylistics which is an extension of linguistics and whose categories one can apply to particular texts in literature, journalism, science, or whatever. So this way, dear scholars, I have succeeded in deliver my lecture in two parts. So this was quite accidental. So this way, my lecture is over. Thank you. Thank you for your patient hearing and coping with me all through. Thank you. Good night.